The French and German leaders have said that the record number of fires in Brazil's Amazon rainforest is, they didn't hold back, an international crisis which has to be discussed at this weekend's G7 summit, which takes place in Biarritz over the weekend. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel said it was an acute emergency and it belonged on the agenda, and she agreed with the French President Emmanuel Macron's earlier rallying cry in which he said, "Our house is burning." He tweeted, "Our house is burning." Environmental groups say that the fires are linked to the Brazilian President Bolsonaro's policies. He denies it. He's also accused the French president of meddling in the situation for political gain. Now, going back probably, a quarter of a century or more, if you remember those days, you'll probably remember the campaign that was spearheaded, or certainly included, and used the fame of one Sting. Sting and his wife, Trudy Styler, were very active on this front about the Amazonian rainforests and what was happening to them. And progress of a sort was made, but this seems to be a backward step, and a backward step that certainly one of the individual world leaders who can do something about it appearing to turn his back on the idea. But I want to talk not just about Bolsonaro, but about all our world leaders. Are they taking this situation seriously? Do you trust them to act on it? 0345 6060 973, the number to call. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. And if you think it doesn't concern you, Tom Burke is here to explain why it might. He's chairman of E3G, former advisor to 3 secretaries of state for the environment and formerly executive director of Friends of the Earth. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, Sylvia.
Welcome back. We had you on during the Extinction Rebellion protests, didn't we?
That's right.
Now, let's go back a quarter of a century to the days when Sting would appear on the Wogan show explaining why we had to care about the rainforests. What was happening then, and what was done then and after that period?
There was a very big campaign run all over the world, but a very lot of British organisations very involved, Greenpeace in particular, to just raise awareness about the threats to the Amazon rainforest. A lot of the attention then focused on logging and illegal logging, people
cutting down of trees,
trees, and cutting down trees in areas where they were protected for indigenous people. There are a lot of indigenous people living in the Amazon still, particularly even more so back 25 years ago, and so a lot of the illegal logging that time was damaging it. Greenpeace made a big drew a lot of attention to that. There was also a lot of anxiety about cattle ranching and the burning of the forest for cattle ranching. Of course, that immediately connected to hamburgers and so on. So there was a whole really big campaign to raise awareness about the Amazon rainforest, and I think it had a real influence.
Well, let's talk about them, what they are and why they matter. They're home to about 3 million species of plants and animals, 1 million indigenous people, you touched on that, the largest rainforest in the world, and it's a vital carbon store, isn't it, for the planet, that slows down the pace of global warming?
I think it's exactly right. I think that's interesting that Macron picked up the idea that our house is burning, which of course applies to climate change as well. And we're about to have another heat wave, so we'll get another taste of it ourselves. But the Amazon rainforest does 2 important things. Burning it does 2 really important, one bad, which is that if you burn it, you create a lot of carbon dioxide, you add more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, that makes the problem worse. And it also acts as a sink. So when we put carbon into the atmosphere, about a third of it gets absorbed by vegetation. Now, the Amazon is some of the biggest areas on the planet. Densest areas of vegetation, of photosynthesis, absorbing that carbon. So if you burn it down and you don't replace it with forest, then what you end up with is you're eliminating a sink. So you're adding more and taking away our capacity to drain.
You're setting fire to the planet's engine room of decarbonisation almost.
Yeah, you're certainly making our problem of climate change worse. And of course, you're then doing all the other damage, that's right. And it's not just damage to species. We tend to sometimes forget that there are human beings who live in the Amazon too, and they're people who are being damaged exactly by the same pressures that are damaging the climate, are also damaging the lives of people, and they're destroying the biodiversity. Now, that biodiversity, we, in our very tech days, we forget how many brilliant new inventions are actually ways in which we mimic what's going on. We now do it cleverly with our own kit, but we mimic a lot of things we've learnt by studying biodiversity. It's not as if it's some kind of remote thing for scientists and academics.
Explain what you mean by that exactly. By watching how the natural world works and then copying it in ways with engineering, mechanical, you name it.
That's exactly right, Sylvia. Biomimicry is what it's called. We literally copy things we've learned by doing detailed study of the different species of plants or animals. If you don't have the plants or animals and that diversity, you've got a lot less to study to come up with things that we can use ourselves.
And in his tweets, Emmanuel Macron, you pointed out, he said our house is burning, and then he said literally the Amazon, the lungs which produce 20% of our planet's oxygen, is on fire. 20, but that's a huge amount of our oxygen.
It's really important, and that's the other side of absorbing the carbon dioxide, is in photosynthesis, when plants take in the carbon dioxide to build their own proteins, their own
GCSE biology, everyone.
Sorry,
GCSE, no, it's good.
Right time. As they do that, they keep the carbon, and they release the oxygen, and that's what we breathe.
I'll tell you who's concerned. Boris Johnson. His office has just said the Prime Minister is deeply concerned by the increase in fires in the Amazon rainforest, and he will use this weekend's G7 summit in Biarritz to call for a renewed focus on protecting nature and tackling climate change further. His father, Stanley Johnson, has been very active on the environment, hasn't he, over the years?
Yeah, I've known Stanley for a very long time. I've known Stanley for about 40 years, from when he was a councillor in the Commission, the European Commission, and before he became, well, certainly before he became Boris's dad, almost.
Is there in Europe, over the span of those 4 decades, say, that you're aware of, has there been an effective drive to secure some of these mechanisms?
Yeah, and Stanley was very much part of that. Boris's dad, very much part of creating the sort of European environment policy that's made a huge difference, and actually made a difference not just in the rest of the continent, but quite a lot of the time made a real difference to us. And right now, the pressure for us to improve the air that people in Britain breathe is largely a result of European legislation that we've failed to implement properly. So it's played a very important part.
It's hard to get people to care, isn't it?
Actually, I don't agree with that, Sylvia.
You don't agree with it?
No, I don't think there's anything wrong with the people of this country. I
wasn't maybe I was remembering my younger self when I didn't pay enough attention. I do now, but I didn't.
Yeah, and I think most people have gone through exactly that journey, and most people care. I don't think they look for what they can do in their own lives, and that they expect to get good leadership in their businesses or from their politicians about what we can do together. And that's, even in a lot of businesses now, you find there's a real effort from the managements of business to pick up on what their employees want and do something what they can. Where we're failing is getting enough out of our politicians.
Well, I was going to come on to that, because we have Bolsonaro saying it's the charity, it's the NGOs, it's the aid agencies doing it. And then he says it could be the farmers, and no sense that he has any influence in changing the behaviours of people. You have Donald Trump almost denying climate change, well, actually denying climate change. I mean, they'll come and go, leaders. Are we going backwards in terms of leadership on this?
In some respects, in some places. I think in other places we're not going backwards, we're going on. I mean, this country, for instance, on climate change has had a very good leadership. We're probably the most progressive country in the world in dealing with climate change. That's a reputation Boris now has to live up to and uphold, because I think we've been very good. But others, what you've seen, well, it's not an accident that Bolsonaro gets elected president, and all of a sudden the number of fires in the Amazon doubles, because he says, essentially, we don't care. And not only does he say, we don't care about that, it's ours, we can burn it if we like, he also destroys the institutions that have been put in place, partly as a result of the campaigns by people
What
like
institutions?
Sting. Well, things like Obama, the Environment Agency, which he's now made a subordinate bit of the Agriculture Agency, the Space Agency, which does the monitoring, satellite monitoring. He's just fired the head.
So taking the teeth out of the very thing
exactly.
that could...
Exactly. I mean, so that, you can't enforce the laws that are... If you're not going to obey the laws, you don't want anybody around to enforce.
And given that these, I mean, that they matter, of course, while they're in office, but given that they will all come and go, is the sort of body politic of environmentalism enough to counter their inaction?
No, I mean, environmentalists can do their part, but the real job of environmentalists, the NGOs that Bolsonaro has been so rude about, their job is to raise public awareness and try and focus the attention of the public. But at the end of the day, it's governments who can do most about it, or politicians. I mean, politicians by getting governments to do the right thing, and businesses and institutions, particularly, I mean, again, area where I think we're doing really well in the world is financial institutions, simply moving the money around differently so it goes into places that make things better rather than make things worse.
What if somebody's listening at home thinking, I don't really get this, I don't know why it should matter to me, what would you tell them to do? That video is worth looking at, isn't it, of the view from space of the rainforest burning? I mean, it's shocking. It
is shocking, but let me bring that right home and in a sense raise a quite important issue. In a sense, what Mr. Bolsonaro is saying is, look, it's our Amazon, we should be free to do what we like with it. But what's the interest of the person here is freedom from floods, freedom from extreme weather events. And his freedom to wreck the ability of the Amazon to contribute to saving the climate, taking away the freedom of people here to be free from all sorts of damage to their lives. So you can't just simply look at, in a world of 8 billion people,
we have to dance together on this.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. We have no choice about that.
Your calls to Tom Burke, if you do get them in, because if you, I always find it very instructive talking to you, and if you have any questions for Tom, or even think, you're not buying it. You're not buying that this is as serious as Macron and Merkel are saying it is, and others, of course, but they've very much brought it to the fore, and Boris Johnson is clearly backing them on this. Do you have faith in world leaders to stop this, and are you listening to the message? Are you listening to the dangers of all this burning in the Amazon are causing? And I'd urge you to look at the video. We'll put it, I think it's up on our website anyway. If not, we'll make sure that it gets up there, and I will tweet it as well. The video recorded from space of the Amazon rainforests on fire. It's an absolute shocker if you haven't seen it. 0345 606 0973, the number to call. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC to put your questions to Tom Burke, chairman of E3G, former advisor to 3 secretaries of state, no less, for the environment, and former executive director of Friends of the Earth. It's 17 minutes past 1. That question of people understanding, Tom Burke is still with me in the studio, the question of people understanding in a very real way why the burning of a forest many thousands of miles away will, without a shadow of a doubt, have an impact on the lives that they and their children and their children's children lead if we don't do enough about it now. You said something to me in the break which I thought was rather striking, that you really fear for the under 40s on this. Elaborate on that for me.
Yeah, it's just if you look at climate change, basically we've got to the middle of the century to get it right, to keep a climate that's manageable, in which people can expect to have a decent sort of life, decent standard of living, enough prosperity and security, if you like, for them to have children. I think we're threatening that prospect, and I think that's very difficult. My parents had a very clear idea of how and what they needed to do to make sure I had a better life than they'd had. It was really clear, and it was about education and going to university or what have you, and
being supported.
And being supported, and they knew exactly what to do, and they knew it would work, and it did work. It was great for them, and in a sense, validated what they'd done. I think it's much harder for people under 40 to have, as they look at these environmental problems accumulating, to have that same sort of confidence that my parents had.
But what will they lose, in your view?
Well, I've heard it literally. That you hear women saying they're not sure about having children. I mean, that really they're not sure they want to bring children into a world that's as potentially insecure as that.
But is that, with a very small age, is that a hysterical response to this? I mean, doesn't every generation have its sword of Damocles over its head of one form or another? I mean, when I was a kid, it was nuclear. I mean, it hasn't gone away, but it was nuclear war. The generation before me, it was actual war. The generation before them, it was actual war throughout the world.
The fact that there may have been times when the worst didn't happen doesn't mean that the worst cannot happen.
No, true.
And so I'm a bit suspicious of that line of reasoning. I think I understand the feeling. I suspect a lot more people say that than do that at this stage. But when people under 40 now are thinking about having, their children are thinking about having children, then I think you're talking about a sword that will be very close to their throats, is what my sense of it is.
And another point you made during the break, and I'm just it's great during the break, we just get it all out now. You also made the point that actually, unlike those wars I mentioned, for example, a damaged climate, a damaged planet affects everybody.
Yeah, there are 8 billion of us on the planet, and this is a problem that literally affects the lives, and we're beginning to see some of those effects already in some parts, literally of every single person. Now, there are lots of people whose lives are damaged by conflict, or they're damaged by poverty, or they're damaged by a lack of education or ill health. But there are also lots of people who have none of those problems. Climate change, everybody has the problem. And what that means is we really have got to understand that cooperation is essential to solving this. Nobody can solve this on their own.
Let me bring in Lee. He's called from Kensal Rise, wants to put a question to you. Hello, Lee.
Yes, sir.
You can talk to Tom now, he can hear you.
Hi, Lee.
Well, I'll do whatever I can.
Did you want to put your question to Tom?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind asking them why they have replicated the disaster in Indonesia, whereby they replaced the rainforest with farmland for palm oil.
I think that's a really important point, and one that's very germane politically in this country as we look forward after Brexit to negotiating free trade agreements. Malaysia's already said, well, if we want a free trade agreement with Malaysia, then we better give up subscribing to the EU prohibitions on the use of palm oil. And I couldn't agree more that one of the most destructive things we've done to the planet, actually, and to biodiversity on the planet, has been replacing tropical rainforests with palm oil plantations.
And tell us what products that leads to.
You'd be amazed. Everything from biscuits and soap, extraordinary, to fuels. I mean, in some biofuels use palm oil, but it's in a lot of cosmetics, it's in biscuits and other sort of food products. You find it all over the place.
And it's coming back to me that the orangutans in Malaysia are badly threatened by that.
Well, no, that's exactly right. I mean, the orangutans are one of the species that's most like us in the way they live, and they live together in groups, and the family groups are quite similar in some ways to human family groups, and we're destroying their homes, literally destroying their homes to replace them, and that's not fantastically beneficial to the people of those countries. It's beneficial to large enterprises and very rich people in those countries, much more so than it is to the population at large.
And Lee, how confident are you that
am I on the air?
You are on the air, yes. How confident are you that global leaders are as...
No, I read the papers, and I'm a businessman, and I study global economics, and so I have my observations.
Okay, Lee, thank you for them. Thanks very much indeed. Lee in Kensal Rise, focusing on farmland for palm oil, replacing rainforests in Malaysia. Elias has called from Swiss Cottage. Hello, Elias.
Hi. I was going to talk about, the deforestation, how it's deeply concerning. In the future, I want to be a biologist. So, the loss of biodiversity and the loss of forests is going to cause problems for future biologists, since we won't have species to we won't have more species to study. The loss of species is just immensely saddening.
And you're only young, Elias. You're 15, is that right?
Yes.
And is this a topic that you obviously feel passionately about it, but do you intend to use your knowledge in the future for the environment?
Well, yes, I do. Hopefully I could stop this madness from happening. Because, think of it, farmers want more land. Well, we as humans want more land to farm, build houses. But, at the same time, we need some space for the forest. So, there was, as I remember, a biologist who proposed to give half of the earth to, humans, and then half of the earth to animals. Not literally, but by nature reserves.
Okay, Elias, thank you for your call, Elias in Swiss Cottage. That question of how much of the planet is farmed and how much of it is built on, just looking even at the United Kingdom, a very small amount of our land is built on, isn't it, comparatively?
A relatively small amount of our land is built on.
But a huge amount
a huge proportion of our land has been changed in order to provide the food for people to live in the bits that they do actually inhabit. So the amount of Earth's surface, I've got the number somewhere, but I don't have it in my head right at the moment, is very large. The amount of the surface that we transform in order to supply largely for the food we eat. I mean, some of it's to provide fibre as well, but the dominant piece is for the food we eat. And there are lots and lots and lots of knowledge we don't use about how to do that better.
What if another Bolsonaro, another Trump comes along? What if they are insensitive to the things that you're describing? And it goes on for 20, 30 years. What then?
Well, I think the thing to bear in mind is sooner or later this will lead to conflict. You know, we can't, the rest of the world can't afford to have the Amazon completely burnt down, because it will be damaging to security and prosperity in those countries. So sooner or later, people will have to do things to try, at least, to protect themselves.
And when you say conflict, do you mean war?
Yeah, I do mean war. And there are lots of different ways in which you can have war. But if I was thinking now, I think the Amazon is not where I'd worry most about on that. What I'd worry most about on that is the way in which we're overusing water. And I think we have a major problem around the world something close to 2 billion people on the planet are already living in extreme water stress. So they're not getting enough. There's not enough water to meet their needs every
I spent
day.
time in Jordan and Lebanon and saw that firsthand. I mean, real shortages, real sort of, in Jordan in particular, very clever but very extremely careful planning of their water supplies.
Well, you had the story last year about whether there was going to be day zero in Cape Town when it ran out of water, and they were able to do things to stop that. This year, you've had Chennai in India run out of water. I mean, where there is no water available for most of the people living in that city. Comes in tankers. They send it in trains from 400 kilometers away to supply water. From, literally people stand by the tankers with jars and collect the water. So we're already in a very water-stressed area. We need to become a lot cleverer. Now, as people dam rivers, as they divert rivers for irrigation, so the potential for conflict over access to that water is going to grow.
Been interesting G7 on this front, won't it? Definitely. Thank you. Good to have you in again, Tom. Thanks very much indeed. Tom Burke, chairman of E3G, former advisor to 3 Secretaries of State for the Environment and a former executive director of Friends of the Earth. He's laid it out for you. President Macron did as well, describing the Amazon rainforest as the lungs of the planet. The house is on fire. We face potential resource wars if we don't do enough about that and other environmental issues. Are you listening, and do you trust the leaders to do enough about it?